Hey folks, how's it going? Dr. Spin, Eclectic Time Reviews, and General Musical Meanderings. This week I'm going to be looking at a 1997 album from Yes called Open Your Eyes. Now, if you're a Yes fan like me, you've probably come to this post and you're wondering, why are you covering this album? Because it's a very divisive album. There are people who love this album, and there's people who hate this album, and there's not a whole lot of space in between. It's got kind of a bad rap in the Yes community, and if you look over on Rate My Music, it's the lowest rated Yes album, and it's one of their slowest rating albums. So why would I look at it? Am I one of the people that love it? Well, I think there's more to the album than just saying that it's not a good Yes album, because I think there's a lot to like about the album. There are some really, really strong tracks in the album, and some tracks that aren't so great. But I do actually think that it's a really important piece of Yes history. And for that reason, along with trying to give it credit where credit is due for its outstanding parts, I thought it'd be well worth looking at it, especially in context of Yes's long history. And Yes's history is long. To even look at a brief overview of their entire history is a 10-15 minute conversation. So let's kind of boil it down into the greatest hits, if you will. Yes, of course, is a band that started in the late 60s and kind of came to prominence in the 70s. Being a very dominant force in forging the sound of progressive rock music of the 70s. And one of three big groups that came out of the 70s that created the idea of what progressive rock is. And they're a very volatile group. Even in the 70s, there's at least 6 discrete lineups of the group with members coming in and out. But there is definitely a definitive period for the band that there's a very fervent fan base for. And I like to refer to this particular era of the band as the Starship Trooper. Now, the Starship Troopers are the people who really love the sort of technical, melodic, adventurous nature of the 70s iteration of Yes. And it was one of my favorites. I mean, I love the 70s versions of Yes. But I got into Yes in the 80s, in the 1980s, when 90125 came out. Now, Yes, like many other progressive rock groups, had to reinvent themselves in the 80s in order to keep themselves relevant. And Yes's particular way of reinventing themselves is pretty drastic. They brought in a new guitar player, Trevor Rabin, and a producer, Trevor Horn, who had worked with them before. And they made this album that ended up being a huge seller for them in the early 80s. Now, this is, of course, when I got on board the group. I got 90125 whenever I was probably a freshman in high school, and it was very, very formative for me. And so I count myself amongst the fans who love this era of the band, the big generators, as I like to call this lineup of the people who follow that lineup. Now, the big problem that happens here is that Yes was hugely popular in the 70s due to some of their radio play from the progressive rock past, but Owner of a Lonely Heart and the songs from 90125 really propelled them into like radio pop stardom. And I will still argue that 90125 is probably my favorite Yes album. And that by itself is going to set some Yes fans off, but it's the truth. For me personally, it's my favorite Yes album. And I will tie, of course, a sense of nostalgia to it, but there's lots of strengths to it that I could argue elsewhere. The real relevance of talking about this divide in the group, the Starship Troopers versus the big generators, is that from here on out, there's sort of this battle for the soul of the band that went on after 90125. And throughout the late 80s and all through the early 90s, Yes put out a variety of releases that harkened back in both personnel and spirit to the 70s iteration of Yes. And then back to the 80s iteration of Yes, and they were wagging back and forth. And to the point by where you got in the early 90s, I was a Yes fan in the early 90s, and I wasn't sure who was in the group at a certain point. You know, if I found a Yes album on the racks, I would be surprised as to who the lineup was. And it's not to say that any of those albums were not good. There was some really great music that came out during that time. Talk is a high point from that period. But by the time you get to the late 90s, even fans of Yes were tired of trying to figure out what was going on with the band, what style they were going to go in. They're vacillating back and forth between these two styles. And behind the scenes, it turned out that Yes was kind of starting to dissolve a little bit. They had some troubles with their management, and nobody knew what to do with them. So enter Billy Sherwood. And Billy Sherwood had a relationship with Yes through Chris Squire that dated back to the early 90s in the Union album. He did some work with them then, and had been co-writing with Chris Squire, bass player, for quite a while. And he kind of became proactive about wanting to get Yes back out there. So helped them sort of get the creative juices flowing, helped them find some new management, and inspired the band to come together and create a new album, sort of kind of a new lineup of the group. And that's how this album, Open Your Eyes, came to pass. And by this point, Billy Sherwood was actually installed as a member of the group, arguably in the keyboard role. Although Billy Sherwood's a multi-instrumentalist, at this point in time, he wasn't really associated with any given instrument. But he was, when he came on, he was playing a lot of the backup keyboard parts and just kind of got installed in that part. And then whenever they went on tour, he ended up playing guitar, and they hired Igor Korshev to be their keyboard player. And I think that this particular lineup and the lineup that followed it doesn't get enough credit as its own iteration of the band. It never really had hits. Again, this album didn't do particularly well, but there was definitely something different about this lineup of the band. And in my opinion, it was an attempt to take the two different styles of the band, the sort of florid, cosmic nature, adventurous nature, and melodicism of the 70s group, and pair it with the high-end production and the kind of muscular, rhythmic nature of the 80s iteration of the group. And I feel like in that regard, this album, at its best moments, is extremely successful in that regard. One of the complaints you have with a lot of Yes fans level against this album is that they feel like it's overproduced. And if you ask me, that's the opinion of somebody who's looking at them from the perspective of the 70s iteration. That would be a person who's a Starship Trooper. Because one of the ways in which Yes is trying to combine and rectify the gaps between the different versions of the group is to kind of adopt the 80s wall of vocals production they had going on there. If you think this album is overproduced, clearly you don't like, Leave It or all that stuff that's happening on 90125 and then beyond. Trevor Rabin's version of the band was always characterized by this, shimmering sheets of background vocals. And I mean, Yes was always a vocal group, but he really brought that to the forefront. And that's the sound I hear a lot on Open Your Eyes. And of course, being a guy who's a fan of the 80s and a guy who likes to find the ways that Yes's identity has continuity rather than its differences, I think that that's a very interesting point in this album. I like the way that the vocals are processed here because it connects with my favorite version of the group. Another way that I think that Open Your Eyes and this lineup of the group is a little bit different, and especially in the way that it was recorded, is that you start to notice that Chris Squire's vocals and his presence in the group vocally is more pronounced. Chris Squire has always been a fascinating backup person, a great, great bass player throughout the history of the band, and his voice is absolutely key to the way Yes music sounds. And not just the way his voice sounds, but also the specific way he sings backup vocals. He's got this very interesting way of doing these angular note choices and jumping up to unexpected notes that for the backgrounds that causes unexpected tension and release, especially against whenever John Anderson is singing a more static line on top, he's jumping around underneath. And especially on Open Your Eyes, it's almost like some of those backgrounds become almost overly convoluted from time to time. It's like he's trying to draw a little more attention to himself. And he's also mixed a little bit higher than normal. And he takes lead on a couple of songs as well. So his presence, I think, on this album is a little more more interesting and a little bit more pronounced. And Chris Squire's an interesting guy because, he made one of the best Yes solo albums of the whole body of work that Yes ever made whenever he made Fish Out of Water. But he was never particularly prolific on his own as a solo artist. It's a compelling point to think about how he brought himself forward a little bit more here. And on the albums to follow, you hear his voice a lot more clearly than you have in the past.
Drawn out of the darkness and into the light, you bring me to. Give me hope when I need it. Give me peace when I feel it. Give me life when I breathe it. Give me dreams. Kiss me dreaming. One look in your eyes and I know that it's right for me and you. Do you feel the love shine? Feel the love that shines.
Now, as often I think as this album is successful at capturing the really the aggressive style of Rabin era Yes, and also kind of harkens back to the more positive, upbeat kind of peace and love philosophy that the early Yes was identified with. There are some spots in this album that I think are not so convincing, So if you go out and you get Open Your Eyes, you listen to it, and you get to like Man on the Moon, and you're like, man, those are some corny lyrics. I think that you have a pretty good point there. I mean, the lyrics in that one, I could read you one line of lyrics, and you could probably predict exactly what was going to happen on the next one. They're very cliche, unfortunately. And that's one of them. And then there's another kind of parts in here with I think they try some experiments that just don't quite work. There's a tune on there called Somehow Someday. I think what they're trying to do is capture some of the earth-shattering power of City of Love from 90125. Very plodding and aggressive bass part on that one. And that happens to be in a 3 feel. And then Alan White is doing this 2 feel across it. Now, Alan White's 90s drumming is, I think, characterized by a very aggressive attack on the drums. He's hitting really hard at this point. And I think on Somehow, Someway, his desire to try and just lay it down works against the song a little bit because he's trying to do a 2-beat across this kind of 3-beat pattern. And so it feels like it cycles around, and that's fine. You can make that work. But then every now and then he tries to kind of turn it around and play off the offbeat, and it just feels more disorienting than clever. And especially when we get to one of the middle sections there, John Anderson tries to sing a little melody above it, and he kind of goes off in La La Land like he's singing something like this almost in 6. And by the time you get it all put together, it just feels like it all drifts apart and fails to convince for sure.
Hearts will be chosen. So many times on the clouds of forgiveness, we walk through the country and feel so at ease. A gentle reminder how things really are in the homelands of love. Face to face.
So I don't know that I would suggest to open your eyes to a non-initiated Yes listener, because there's some stuff in here that I think is not the best things that they've done. But I also think that there's a lot of really great things on here. It's an album that's sort of a victim of the CD runtime issue. And I've talked about this in other posts. Yes was always very good at making 45-minute, 50-minute albums. And this album gets a little bit past that. It gets to the hour, almost hour and a, past an hour long, especially if you take the end track, which is another issue. I think that if we had trimmed some of the fat off this album, you've had a really, really lean, killer album that would probably have sold a little bit better, at least to the Yes fan base. At least would have been more convincing overall and would have avoided some of the unevenness that the album suffers from. And you also have the issue of the last track a little bit. The 90s, the cool thing to do was put a hidden track on after the last track. So you get this album, you take it home, you're like, man, they've got this 20-minute song at the end of this album. Great, man, it's Yes's return to form. But in actuality, it's a 4 or 5-minute song, 2 minutes of silence, and this big, long soundscape that happens at the end. Which, Yes has never done soundscapes before. That's kind of a neat thing. But, the whole hidden track thing was cool for a couple of minutes and really did to death in the 90s, and sort of Yes's hand at trying that. But my hope is that if you are a Yes fan, you kind of listen to this once and kind of, shook it off. You'll go back and check it out and maybe give it a second chance, at least with the understanding that there are some stuff on there that I think that's worth listening to. And the other thing about this album that I think is particularly important is that going forward from this album, Yes would go on to do some really amazing stuff with this lineup. You know, the album that followed this was The Ladder, which I feel is probably Yes's last really great album. I would put The Ladder up there with some of their best work. Historically speaking, very solid album. And reaching even further into the future, you start to run into the issue of what happened whenever Chris Squire passed away in 2014, 2015 from leukemia, and Billy Sherwood was brought on per Chris Squire's wishes to take over for him as the bass player and continue the band. And his involvement in this album as a full member of the band lends more credence to that band's lineup. It gives more validity to the identity of that band as a Yes band. And the continuing issue of Yes's identity as a band in lieu of all of these member changes is something that's always fascinated me. And I've written some little bit about it in my previous iteration of this blog post, and I'll put a link underneath there to some of the posts that I've written about this issue. And I also think this is a particularly interesting issue in relation to a most recent release that Billy Sherwood has had called Arc of Life. And in the coming weeks, I'm going to be talking about that album a little bit, and I'm going to be referring to some of the things I talk about in this post in regards to what Yes is and how Yes is able to retain its identity in lieu of all of these membership changes. You know, Yes's identity can survive these kinds of changes because it's always been marked by the perpetual change inside of the band. Yes has always persisted across these member changes. At what point does Yes stop being Yes? That's a question that we'll answer for another day. So when you want to know when that post comes up, please like and subscribe and share this video out with your friends. Of course, follow me over on Spotify. I'll put a track up from Open Your Eyes on my 2021 radio list. And I'll see you guys again on the flip side.